We have 4 incredible speakers now for this session 2, and it's on representations of Daniel O'Connell in visual and material culture, which is an extraordinary subject matter. Because of the 4 speakers, I'm going to be very strict on time. It'll be 20 minutes each and then 10 minutes at the end for questions. So it's my great honour to introduce Dr. Catherine Milligan, who will be discussing an invasion of pen and pencil, picturing the 1875 O'Connell centenary. And Dr. Milligan is Assistant Librarian at the Edward Murphy Library at NCAD. As an art historian, her research focuses on the depiction of Dublin and the city as a site of exhibition and artistic exchange. Recent and forthcoming publications include essays on 19th century exhibition culture, the White Stag Group, and Walter Osborne's domestic paintings. Catherine's monograph, Painting Dublin 1886 to 1949, Visualising a Changing City, was published in 2020 by Manchester University Press and is an excellent read. So I'm going to hand you over now to Dr. Milligan.
No problem at all. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Excellent. It's always a good start. So firstly, I'd just like to thank Emmeline and the Irish Georgian Society for asking me to be part of this really wonderful day. I'm going to be speaking about the O'Connell centenary celebrations in 1875. So 150 years ago. So lots of anniversaries today. So I'm just going to jump straight in. So, as we've heard already this morning, city streets are replete with symbolic markers such as memorial statues, monuments, historic buildings, or contested street names, and these have often formed both the stage and backdrop to important spectacles, whether celebratory and ceremonial or acrimonious, such as demonstrations, protests, and riots. And when we look at Dublin in the second half of the 19th century, we see how the city's streets and bridges often became points of contention as opposing political powers sought to remodel and reform. But alongside these official and civic efforts to rebrand the city, the streets themselves held host to a range of ephemeral spectacles which ran the gamut of political opinion. So we might think of, for example, the very lavish occasions which accompanied royal visits from 1821 onwards, which were occasions of strictly ordered pageantry designed to instill and promote loyalty in the multitudes who came from across Ireland to catch a fleeting glimpse of a monarch, a viceroy, or other member of the royal family. And we know from even these earliest times that these were often events captured in paint, in print, in photographs, and later in film reels. But mirroring these royal occasions were, of course, the national spectacles, with nationalist groups making as much use of spectacle, pageantry, and parade. And certainly, to my eyes, one of the most notable of these occasions was the O'Connell centenary, held in August 1875. This event was prominent due to its scale, its global reach, and also notable for the varied visual and material record which it produced, which spanned painting, illustration, and photography, as well as trade banners and commemorative medals, commemorative sashes, you name it, there is one. But today I'm going to focus on the visual, really looking at one very notable painting and also some of the illustrative accounts of the centenary as well. So the painting that you can see here on the screen is by Charles Russell, and it's simply called the O'Connell Centenary Celebrations. The earliest published mention of this painting actually dates to 1928, when it was included in the catalogue of the National Gallery of Ireland. Thomas Bodkin, then director of the gallery, noted that it showed the laying of the foundation stone of the O'Connell monument, even though it was called the O'Connell Centenary Celebrations. So there was a little bit of confusion over what the painting was showing. But of course he did note that it was the best record in existence of the chief street in Dublin before its almost complete destruction in Easter week 1916. The gallery had acquired the painting in 1927 when it was noted in the minutes simply as a trade procession through Dublin, August 1875, and they purchased it for the princely sum of £20 from Henry Naylor, an antiques dealer on Liffey Street. Charles Russell, a name that may not be familiar, is really because we don't know a massive amount about him. He was born in Scotland, and he seems to have come to Dublin in the late 1860s when he took a position with John Chancellor of the Chancellor & Son photography firm on Sackville Street. We know from other records in newspapers, in Walter Strickland's Dictionary of Irish Artists, that it wasn't unusual for a photography firm to employ an artist. They would either hand colour photographic prints or paint portraits from a photograph. So it was kind of a lower cost way of having your portrait made. So I suppose that's the context in which Russell comes into Ireland, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. Looking at the composition of the painting, we see that it takes in Carlisle, or now O'Connell Bridge, and it pans out to include the buildings on either side of this broad street, stretching past Nelson's Pillar, the General Post Office, up towards the Rotunda, and with the spire of St. George's Church on Hardwick's Place visible in the far distance on the right-hand side. The central street is filled with people. They occupy every inch of the street, as well as the bluing platform on Nelson's Pillar, the rooftops of the buildings, and even in some instances in the windows as well. In the middle and foreground, we see the banners and flags held by the different unions and groups who made up the procession. We see allegorical themes such as Hibernia, Erin, and also O'Connell himself. We have the official platform around the foundation stone of the monument, which is there today, which had been laid a few years previous. And I was going to make reference to Paula's later paper, but she's not with us, so you'll have to read her book instead for more about the O'Connell monument. But really what Russell manages to do in this painting is to convey the scale of the centenary procession. He emphasises elements of the streetscape, the rows of buildings, Nelson's Pillar. It's so familiar. We know from the flags and banners that it's a day of ceremony and celebration within the city. He doesn't really show us much of the crowd in detail, but it is the scale and perspective that draws in our eye. So, a little bit about the celebration itself. Well, the genesis of the O'Connell Centenary came from actually the Monument Committee. So in August 1874, the Monument Committee had resolved that the centenary celebrations would take place. They wrote to John Henry Foley to hurry him along to finish the monument. However, the letter they received back was that he had unfortunately died. But they still continued with the plans for the celebration, albeit now without the completed monument. This is the minute book from the centenary celebration in the National Library, and a poster that is folded up and included in the minute book. And what this shows is actually a letter from, which was reproduced as a poster from the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Peter Paul McSweeney, who had issued a letter to the people of Ireland where he says, and I'm just going to read a little bit from it, he says, "It is your glorious and envied fortune, inheriting as guardians of the traditions of your race and nation, to commemorate the centenary of the birth of O'Connell, one of the greatest Irishmen that has ever lived. It is your duty, nay more, it is your privilege, to add new lustre to your name, your race and your traditions before the world by a fitting celebration of the O'Connell centenary." And McSweeney also invited the scattered elements of the Irish race and our friends dispersed over the globe to come back to Ireland for the occasion. So as we would say today, it was both global and diasporic in its outlook. So McSweeney, just to give you something interesting to look at, was the Lord Mayor, but he was a businessman. He was a partner in the New Mart on Sackville Street, Cleary's, to anyone walking up and down more recently. And this was, during his first term as Lord Mayor, he had overseen the laying of the foundation stone. So he was very much, I suppose, involved with the commemoration of O'Connell. We can see from both the committee book and the O'Connell Centenary Record, which was a lavish gift book published in 1878, which brought together everything really to do with the centenary, that there was a huge international outlook to the centenary celebrations. The committee invited high-ranking members of the Catholic Church across the globe, including the Pope, members of royalty and nobility from across Europe, and high-ranking British Catholics. And when we look at the list of attendees in the centenary record, we see senior members of the Pope's household, a Prussian-Polish prince, members of the Prussian and German parliaments, and senior French bishops. There is also records of who donated to the event, who helped to fund it, and again, they range from very substantial amounts of money from high-ranking figures, but also small church collections from across Ireland. For example, the parish of Ballyvourney in County Cork, the parish priest wrote to the committee saying, enclosed is a small post office order for £2 from this parish in aid of funds for the O'Connell centenary. This small sum is a very inadequate exponent of the profound and undying feeling of respect entertained here for the great and illustrious leader. So, the centenary celebrations themselves began on the 5th of August 1875, a Thursday, and in the centenary record they note that few were found at rest in Dublin at midnight on Wednesday, when the gladsome peals from many a spire and tower joyously rung out in national celebration. The first day of the festivities began with a Mass at the Pro-Cathedral, which was followed by two musical events. There was a recital of Mendelssohn's Elijah at the Exhibition Palace on Earlsford Terrace, and a concert of Irish music with the performance of the O'Connell Centenary Ode, which was written for the occasion by Dennis Florence McCarthy. But it was the events of Friday the 6th of August that marked the high point of the centenary celebrations. And again, we read in the centenary record that the appearance of the city was such as it had never been exhibited. At midnight, the church chimes with merry peals again stirred the hearts of the populace with gleesome strains. Even at that hour, the crowded metropolis was in the throes of bustle and busy preparation. Those taking part in the procession gathered at Stephen's Green at 10 o'clock before beginning their long route through the city, which went almost in a circle around the city, before they came to gather on Sackville Street. And one newspaper said that by the time they reached Sackville Street, they were one solid, impenetrable block of human beings. And I'm going to just read the description from the Freeman's Journal of this incoming crowd into the street. They wrote, "The superb area of Sackville Street opens to receive the multitude, which bursts into it like an ocean let into the empty bed of a lake. Straight on, roaring hugely, with the melody of 100 tempests, the inundation rolls and thunders. The steep side of the enclosure it threatens to flood literally seems to crawl with living beings, so thickly do the beholders cling at roof and window. Nelson's pillar, in the distance, like a tall bully, lift its head and brags, not without reason, it is occupied atop by a lucky few." And so when you read these written descriptions of the event, I think it's really no surprise that the artists were tripping over themselves to try and capture it in images as well. There were a few little snags during the centenary celebrations. There was bad weather in the lead up to it, and also when the procession was approaching Kingsbridge, a group of malcontents tried to infiltrate the procession, and this was a delegation from the Amnesty Association, which included Isaac Butt, and they attempted to join. They were unsuccessful in their attempt to join the procession at Kingsbridge, but they later reformed on Sackville Street, and they claimed a position close to the dais. Now, it's a little hard to see, you'll have to take my word for it, but this black banner here, this is the Amnesty Association, and it is more visible when you look at the painting in real life. There was an oration as part of the celebrations, but Isaac Butt shouted down the Lord Mayor, and in the end made his own quote, nationalist and home rule speeches. The Amnesty Association also then interrupted the banquet at the Exhibition Palace. So it didn't all pass off smoothly either. But unsurprisingly, when the centenary records were published, there was no mention of these events. So, the following day, on the 7th of August, the Freeman's Journal reported that there had been an invasion of pen and pencil from the press, pictorial and serial, as well as journalistic. The combined talent and industry of so many chroniclers of the time will very likely enable us to see ourselves. We know that the illustrated press, which encompasses newspapers, magazines and periodicals, had grown exponentially through the 19th century, catering for a wide market, and illustrations of the centenary appeared in at least 5 publications in Ireland, Britain and France, reflecting the international nature of the event. In Ireland, the weekly Freeman published 2 special illustrated editions showing scenes both from O'Connell's life and the centenary of his birth, so a complete visual history of the main man. The Nation also published illustrations, and then both the Graphic and the Illustrated London News included illustrations in the week following the centenary, showing different moments in the parade. So this is I'm not going to show you all of them, just particularly interesting ones. This is from the Graphic, one of the 5 illustrations that it depicted. So we see here the crowds on the scene in Sackville Street. So we have the dais here with the speeches. There's the Amnesty Association banner, all of the other trade banners kind of coming through. We have flags, newspapers, kind of a mix of different people within the crowd as well. This is from the Illustrated London News. So we have, again, the speeches going on, no microphone, to help them roar into this enormous crowd. And again, the trade banners, here's the Amnesty Association. Interestingly, in this one, we have kind of these carriages among the crowd trying to get through, and then, of course, the GPO and Nelson's Pillar here as well, and some of the other banners. What I think is interesting about these images from the Graphic and the Illustrated London News is that in contrast to Russell's paintings, they do focus on the crowd. It isn't just about that wider spectacle. And as we, I suppose, might expect from illustrations from this period, we see them using some of those kind of simian features, that you would see in Punch reflected in these. So there is that other visual element kind of infiltrating into these celebratory images as well. This is the illustration from the French magazine Le Monde Illustré. Now, you might notice there's a lot of leaves, a lot of trees going on here, which weren't on O'Connell Street. So some of the illustrations certainly were made from various accounts in newspapers, maybe things that had been printed. And in the months leading up to the O'Connell centenary, there had been plans within the corporation to plant trees on O'Connell Street. And I think maybe they picked up on that and then included all of this wonderful foliage within their illustration. But if we leave that aside, we've still got the essential elements: Nelson's Pillar, the GPO, the trade banners, and the kind of multitude of crowds here as well. So let me just see where I have, yes, okay, so these were the illustrations, but the centenary record also noted that Chancellor, the eminent photographer, had secured a magnificent view of the street at the close of proceedings, which will enable posterity to realise a national assemblage unprecedented in majesty and vastness. I have only ever been able to find one copy of this photograph, and this is it here, included in the minute book of the Centenary Committee in the National Library of Ireland and expertly digitised on my request by the team in the library. So, it looks familiar, I think, when we think of it in relation to Russell's painting. It captures the scene running up over the bridge, up the street, and taking in the crowds, the trade banners, and the flags. The print now is a little damaged in places, a little overexposed. Someone has at some point used a pen just to add back in some details on the flag, on the banner here. It's been loved, looked at and loved, and attempts have been made just to flesh out the details a little bit. But when we compare this with Russell's painting, it really seems like we are looking at two things that were created in conjunction with each other. So this is the painting, this is the photograph. So I think it is no coincidence that Russell, being employed by the Chancellor firm, who actually had their offices kind of along here so they were right in the heart of it, that he was drawing on the photograph for his painting. When the centenary had finished, Chancellor advertised in all of the papers that their finally executed photographs would be available for sale, and they were praised in the Irish Times for their faithfulness, which is really astonishing considering the great extent of the view and the ever-surging movement of the masses. And you could purchase them for 1 or 2 shillings depending on the size of print that you wanted, and it was emphasized that this was a souvenir that was affordable. This wasn't a grand painting, it wasn't an expensive etching, that the photograph made it reasonably affordable for people to have. There was also an advertisement to say that the photographs would be stenographed, which again was another 19th century photomechanical way of producing something like an engraving from a photograph. So again, cheaper and mass producible for people to purchase a souvenir as well. I'm not going to talk about the trade banners, but just to note that they are a whole other part of the visual culture of this, and I think there's great work to be done there. But just to note that they appear a lot in the planning, and that sense of using trade banners that had been used at mass meetings for the repeal movement, for different trade processions in the life of O'Connell. That pride in then bringing them to the O'Connell centenary celebrations is really important. So just to conclude, writing about the representation of crowds in 19th century Irish painting, Mary Jane Boland posed that rather than accurately recording the public assemblies themselves, images of the crowd are about projecting the aspirations and beliefs of those that were looking at them. When we read Russell's depiction of the centenary against the organisation and unfolding of these celebrations themselves and the wider visual and material culture in which it operates, we see that the artist has captured something both of the spectacle and the complexity of the event, neither erasing the protest of the Amnesty Association nor glorifying the political or religious beliefs of those who organised it. He also avoids castigating the participants as unruly caricatures, as we see in some of the illustrations. Yet, amongst the wealth of visual and material culture, the extensive reports of the centenary celebrations, the question of who this painting was made for or who its intended audience was remains cloaked in mystery. And I do have some thoughts, but I know I'm coming to the end of my time. But I hope you have found this interesting and will maybe look at this painting anew next time you see it. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much for that, Catherine, that was fantastic. So the next one, obviously up, is Ben Casey, looking at, will you let me know how my speech and picture get on, the portraiture of Daniel O'Connell. So Ben is a PhD student in the History Department at Maynooth University. His project is entitled Picturing the Professions, Depictions of the Professions, 1760 to 1830, and is supported by a Research Ireland, Government of Ireland Postgraduate Scholarship. Ben's research examines how members of the legal and medical profession were depicted in image and text during a period associated with the commercialisation of leisure and significant developments in the art market. Ben is the 2024 recipient of the Irish Georgian Society's Desmond Guinness Scholarship. So over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Audrey, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Emmeline, and everyone in the Irish Georgian Society for inviting me here today to speak. It's a great privilege to be here. I might get my timer out because I could speak for a while here. Bear with me 1 sec. But it's a great privilege to be here, and the idea of Daniel O'Connell and the portrait of Daniel O'Connell is it's a daunting thing, it's a challenging thing to talk about, just based off the fact that there's so many portraits exist of him. Fintan Cullen has noted that no other Irish politician in the early 19th century has received the same degree of visual representation. His portrait was omnipresent. It was on paintings, it was on engravings, it was on tablecloths, it was on you name it, tobacco tins, everything. So this paper, it's not going to give an exhaustive survey of every portrait that exists. Today I want to just focus in on a number of key examples taken at different stages in his career, which I think can tell us some interesting things about O'Connell, the man, his famous vanity, which we're all familiar with, but also the participation of others in constructing this image of O'Connell in the public imagination. So we know that O'Connell was conscious of his appearance and somewhat sensitive about it. He fretted over his weight. He lamented his baldness. By his 40s, he was wearing a wig. And in 1846, when his political and financial manager, Patrick Vincent Fitzpatrick, asked him to sit for yet another portrait, O'Connell quipped that he would rather give somebody the opportunity to flog him for an hour. Yet, even as he claimed to despise portrait sittings, describing them as one of the great bores of his life, along with giving autographs, he also understood the power of image and how it could be used to cultivate, to manifest a particular vision of himself and his movement. Okay, so to begin with, O'Connell's fascination with portraiture stemmed from his childhood. Growing up, he read the Dublin magazine, which his uncle, Hunting Cap, subscribed to, but it wasn't the articles that attracted the young Daniel's imagination. It was the engraved portraits that were attached to these magazines, especially that of his political hero, Henry Grattan. And from an early age, O'Connell told his family, in very typical O'Connell fashion, one day my portrait is going to be in that magazine. And his dream came true. It was accomplished. In 1810, when he was walking down a street with a friend in Dublin, he noticed an engraving of himself, this one here, hung up in a shop window. And it accompanied one of his speeches, which was published in Walker's Hibernian magazine. And he jokingly remarked that his boyish dreams had come true, but later, qualified that by saying that he had long outgrown that species of ambition. But his correspondence tells us a different thing. Writing to his wife Mary, he asked her to let him know how his speech and his picture got on. And what ensues is quite a charming correspondence, which is very typical of Daniel and Mary O'Connell. She teases him about his appearance, and he says that it's thought too striking. It's quite striking, but it's thought too handsome. And what this, I think, reveals is to a degree his self-consciousness at a time. This is 1810. He was still finding his feet on the political stage, asking to know not only how his speech got on, but how his picture got on. Suggests that he considered the visual likeness to be as important as the printed speech. And as Fergus O'Farrell in his seminal chapter has argued, O'Connell's transition from barrister to political agitator made him one of the first Irish figures to consciously develop a public image. Okay, so then by the late 1810s and early 1820s, there was beginning to become, there was great demand amongst artists to paint O'Connell as his star was in the ascent. And the Limerick painter, John Gubbins, was commissioned to carry out the portraits of the entire O'Connell family. And these portraits can still be seen in Derrynane House today for visitors. In March 1818, Gubbins paints O'Connell, and again, this is kind of seen as one of the first portraits that shows him as a man of action. He's a champion of the people. The pose is all there. It's classic portraiture. And it was later engraved by a young Dublin engraver, Brian O'Reilly. And again, when he's writing to Mary, he's very complimentary of O'Reilly and says that this time we shall not be disappointed. So, as the 1820s progressed, he began campaigning for election to Westminster, and we've heard about the importance of spectacle and ceremony in this image building. And his portrait was beginning to be seen outside Dublin. It was becoming ubiquitous all throughout the country. And Gary Owens has written about how O'Connell's image became fixed in the public imagination, and that the importance of visual display in mobilizing his mass support. So flags and banners bearing his likeness were carried through the streets of Ennis and Ennismoyne during the Clare election. Brewers in Clare distributed painted signs which depicted him standing in the House of Commons holding the petition for emancipation. And a reporter for the Morning Herald noted that you cannot travel a mile without meeting one of these smiling petitioners at the bar. So, with that said now, his portrait was also the source of some tension and dispute. So in Galway, in 1828, police constables were accused of burning a printed portrait of O'Connell in a public house, and they were later dismissed from the service. And when a Clare publican refused to remove I think it was a flag bearing his portrait from a roadside, local magistrates tore it down, which resulted in some tension there. And we know as well with the Munster repeal meetings how his portrait was often hung alongside the portraits of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, creating quite a striking visual spectacle. So, I think we're all familiar with this portrait. I think this is the classic portrait we all think of when we think of O'Connell. It's the Joseph Patrick Haverty's one here. And this was commissioned by the Catholic Association, the organisation that he established. There's been much written about this portrait, and he's standing in a rural landscape. He's accompanied by his Kerry wolfhound. He's wrapped in his cloak. He looks the image of the ancient Gaelic chieftain, which he long sought to be. And this portrait was later engraved by William Ward there in 1836, which prompts me to raise an important point here. The different functions between painted portraits and engraved portraits. So, in general, and there are obviously exceptions with art exhibitions, but paintings were designed for private display, whereas engraved prints were designed for wide public consumption. But we're all familiar with this portrait. But another one I want to show is the portrait painted by John Comerford in 1825. And this is produced at quite a fraught time for O'Connell. There was divisions in the Catholic Association, and it was commissioned by a group of followers who wished for it to be engraved and circulated widely. And he's holding a scroll labeled "The Catholic Rent," and he's bearing an outstretched hand. Ruan O'Donnell has talked about how a lot of his portraits were designed for public consumption. I think this is another example of it. My favorite thing about this portrait this portrait is the story behind its publication and its development. So there was significant delays in its publication, and O'Connell was constantly writing back. He was in England at the time, and he's writing back to Mary, asking, "Is there any update? Have you heard from Comerford? Is it coming out? When is it coming out?" And eventually, he was so frustrated that he complained that the first artist in London would have pressed to paint my portrait had he not promised the commission to Comerford. So I think this offers quite an interesting insight into the the paradox of O'Connell. He's championing Irish manufacturers, yet he's also boasting about the fact that Thomas Lawrence would be eager to paint me. And so advertisements, when it was eventually published in Dublin, urged those desirous of obtaining an impression to apply quickly, as only a limited number of proofs would be issued, so while stocks last. And one of the print sellers that stocked the portrait was James Del Vecchio, who had his shop in Westmoreland Street. And the interesting thing about Del Vecchio is the fact that he appears to have been a supporter of O'Connell. So he makes donations to the Catholic Rent. And you can see there as well, John Comerford is making a sizable donation of £50 as well. And what these episodes suggest maybe is that Comerford and Del Vecchio, they weren't just motivated by commercial reasons to sell O'Connell, which of course it's quite evident, but that there may have been some ideological alignment with their beliefs and causes. And the Comerford portrait was reproduced on silk handkerchiefs that were worn by O'Connell's supporters, further expanding its visibility in the public sphere. An example of this is seen in this detail from Daniel McLeese's Snapapple Night. And one of the female figure here with with her back to us is wearing a shawl, which is bearing the Comerford portrait. Interestingly, McLeese used his sister as the model for this figure here. Okay, so by the 1830s, we know he'd achieved Catholic emancipation. He'd entered Westminster. His image was beginning to evolve in response to his growing, his growing fame and the growing political roles that he was aligning himself with. And he figures prominently in George Hayter's painting of the House of Commons. You can't see here. Where is he? He's right here. He's almost sitting up. He's ready to get into the debate. And Hayter, this is the preparatory sketch that Hayter had done of him. He also, Benjamin Robert Hayden's painting here of the Anti-Slavery Convention. You see O'Connell is tucked away in the corner here. Again, reflecting his support of the abolitionist cause. But I wanted to just highlight maybe one more portrait here for you, and this is I think one of my favorites, one of the most striking portraits of O'Connell, which is in the National Gallery. I'd urge you all to see it. It was painted by a Scottish artist, Sir David Wilkie, and Wilkie was asked by one of the directors of the newly established National Bank of Ireland to paint this portrait. And Wilkie was initially kind of hesitant. He thought, O'Connell is quite a controversial figure, but he couldn't help himself. It was too great an opportunity to paint, the liberator himself. So Wilkie was fascinated by this idea of addressing Protestantism and Catholicism in art, and he thought portrait of O'Connell would be a great idea. This was not made easy for him, though. Okay, so according to O'Connell's biographer William O'Neill Daunt, Wilkie would send his carriage to collect O'Connell to bring him to the artist's studio. Oftentimes, this carriage returned empty. Eventually, it was painted, and he got his sittings in, and it was regarded by Wilkie and by the general public as being one of his finest works, and it was displayed in the Royal Academy show that year, where it again hung next to portraits of Queen Victoria. And Fintan Cullen again describes Wilkie's portrait as celebratory. He's being portrayed as the acceptable face of Irish politics. Okay, And again, another example of this sort of this reluctance to sitting for one's portrait is seen in Charles Alan Duval's painting of him. And Charles had to settle for sittings while O'Connell took breakfast. Okay. So again, this leads me to sort of, I'll conclude on this. You know, why was there this reluctance on the part of O'Connell to sit? You know, why did a man so keenly aware of the power of image and, you know, and the spectacle find the act of sitting so intolerable? I think part of the answer lies in simple vanity and in simple human vulnerability. A lot of the portraits we're seeing are, you know, as I said, a man of action. But you look at the letters, you read the letters and the correspondence with his wife, and there's a human side there, you know. As Maurice Brick will discuss later, O'Connell was regularly depicted in caricature in this period. So I think, you know, Fintan Cullen has said that portraits are kind of an antidote to a lot of the negative image, a lot of the negative visual representations that were being circulated at the time. And his anxiety about likeness and how he was being depicted created these carefully thought out and curated portraits. So, by the time of his death in 1847, his face was the most recognizable in Ireland. His portrait was circulated on a panoply of mediums, making him Ireland's first modern celebrity politician, I think. And again, returning to the 1810 letter, when he asked Mary to let him know how his speech got on, we get an insight into his preoccupation with image and the centrality of his portrait in shaping the public's imagination of him. O'Connell's image was not a mere embellishment, which was, you know, to be attached to his very famous speeches, but are a separate phenomenon and are worthy of attention and their own study. Gurmina Margaret.
Thank you. Very good to see you. You might be wondering what is a geographer doing here standing in front speaking about Daniel O'Connell. Hopefully it will become clear in the next 20 minutes or so, but it's about a map. Now, Daniel O'Connell died in Genoa on the 15th of May 1847 on his way to Rome. Word took some time to reach Dublin. Though the Freeman's Journal was already in mourning mode, it had black lines all around its columns because the Lord Lieutenant, Earl Bessbrook, had died. This had been noted on the 17th of May, the death having been anticipated for some time. The paper published much more positive news about O'Connell, and generally referring to him simply as a liberator. He was not in good health, but the short report noted that he had borne the tedious journey to Genoa well, and that he is not only beyond comparison better than when leaving England, but continues to improve rapidly. By the 20th of May, the news reported was still good. O'Connell had suffered from a derangement of the stomach, which necessitated medical intervention, but he was on the mend. It was not until Wednesday, the 22nd of May, that his death was reported. Under the heading, Death of the Liberator, the Freeman wrote, "With feelings of profound grief, we have to announce the death of the great chieftain, an event that will fill Ireland, not only fill Ireland alone with sorrow, but will send a shock through the civilized world and mark an epoch in the history of mankind." Now, it took time to organize the funeral, and it was only at the end of July that O'Connell's body was transported to Dublin. This had allowed for the removal of his heart with the intention that it should proceed to Rome. It was lodged in the Irish College, which had been set up in Rome in St. Agatha del Gotti, and from which it was duly lost and hasn't been seen since. There was more certainty with the body. And the event was covered in great detail by the Illustrated London News, and because of this, there are good graphical representations of what transpired. The coffin travelled from Genoa via Paris and arrived in Le Havre on the 22nd of July, 1847. The family refused a lying in state in the church, I should say cathedral, due respects, of Notre Dame, and he was placed instead in a side chapel. This did not prevent a steady stream of visitors until his body was taken to Southampton on the 24th of July. The body arrived by train in Chester on the evening of the 26th, and it was placed in its elaborate outer coffin. This, it seems, was ahead of schedule, and the body remained there fairly quietly until the following Sunday. So it was only on the 2nd of August that O'Connell was taken to Birkenhead and loaded on board the Duchess of Kent. This is the city of Dublin's relatively new steamer. It had been built in 1837, and it was a paddle steamer, and it was regarded as being fast for the time. It was going to take 11 hours. Now, up to this point, it's been largely a family business, but now it's going to change dramatically. And this began when the steamer came within sight of Kingston. It was greeted by a flotilla of craft of all kinds, flags at half-mast, gun salute. The yacht Nimrod had intercepted the Duchess of Kent, and John O'Connell had boarded and briefed all as to the arrangement that had been made. The ship made for Dublin port slowly and met up with another boat, the Arran Castle, which allowed more family members and some dignitaries to board. And this permitted a private period of mourning because a small sea chapel, as they called it, had been assembled on the deck of the Duchess of Kent. And this being done, the ship travelled up the bay and into the port of Dublin. And this facilitated the segue from what had been, as I say, a largely private and family matter into something that was going to be quite different when the ship docked in George's Quay. The ship docked in George's Quay, and the Freeman's Journal reported that a large number of clergy went aboard to pay their respects. So many, it is a wonder that the ship stayed afloat. Then the public funeral began. Now, this was clever. This was going to have to be stage managed very, very carefully. After all, there had been a charge of sedition not that many years previously. So it was going to be a celebration. It was going to be a massive celebration of the man and his achievements, though not in an overtly political way, though of course it was going to become political, no matter what you did about it. So Dublin Castle took a deep breath, the organisers took a deep breath, and so it began. He was transported on an open bier without canopy, drawn by 6 black horses, with mutes and wand bearers, and it was preceded by a large procession from the associated trades. It went to the Metropolitan Church, St. Mary's Pro-Cathedral, and it was set up on a specially built catafalque just inside the main entrance, in the nave, and this permitted the throngs of people who wanted to pay their respects easy access, and it appears that the church stayed open until 11 p.m. that night to facilitate that. But this is only getting going. Mass and the Office of the Dead was celebrated on Wednesday morning with admission to the Pro-Cathedral by ticket only. The clergy occupied all of the prime locations in the nave. The Freeman's Journal suggested that there were 1,500 of them, although if you know the Pro-Cathedral, you'll wonder how they would manage to get 1,500 into the nave, but it was full. This was an occasion not to be missed. There is within the reports the usual distinctions as to worry as to what we call the church. Is it St. Mary's? Is it the Metropolitan Church? Is it the Pro-Cathedral? An argument which still goes on. The current Archbishop of Dublin unwisely dipped his toe into that argument a couple of years ago, and now the Pope has been asked to sort it out finally. Following Mass. And there are a number of steps along the way where you have this event management. This is, we think event management is modern. That this is something that happens only since we became all computerized and all this sort of stuff. No, this is event management. So this is the Catholic Church now claiming him. So following Mass, the Church copper-fastened by giving him a solemn absolution. This was following a rite which was reserved for popes, bishops, and princes. It involved the 5 senior bishops arranging themselves around the catafalque. And you can see the catafalque, and you can see the amount of space that is taking up in the church. And with the most senior one at the head, they intoned the required prayers, including the Liber Mei Domine, praying for the repose of his soul. This claimed, the Freeman's Journal, raised Connell to the status of Prince of the Church. Now, it didn't stop it saying so. And according to the Freeman, thus ended the most solemn obsequies ever celebrated in Dublin. Until the following day. Now, central to this the following day was going to be a public funeral which had been organised by the Dublin Cemeteries Committee, an organisation in which O'Connell had been a vital figure. The order of procession was published in the Freeman's Journal, but it was only slightly informative. But the route was going to take it all over the city. So you have, this is the Pro-Cathedral, this is Glasnevin Cemetery, this is the Gravediggers Pub, and you can see they didn't exactly say, now folks, we're going to the cemetery and off we go. We are heading right around Dublin, passing all of the elements of significance. So we'll see Trinity College, Merrion Square, up Dublin Castle, wandering out actually to this new railway station thing. This map is from 1837, so the railway is not shown on this, and then back in. You'd have got your steps up. Now, this was a solemn event, of course, but that didn't prevent people from, there was no reason not to make money. Building owners sought to capitalize on the view. Parties wishing to view the view can be accommodated in the windows of 26 Capel Street. A window exclusive, £1, 1847. A seat for a lady or a gent, 7 and 6. A single spectator, 5 shillings. An early application is necessary, as the majority of the places are engaged. Or this one down here, Sackville Street, number 26, single tickets, 5 shillings, children half price. Or you could go to Ainger Street and having from its site until it passes, a single window or an entire room will be given, apply at the house. So, as we can see, we are making the most of it. And this is where we come to my map. The map on the left-hand side was produced specially for the event. It's an ephemeral piece. It was drawn and printed on stone by John Joseph O'Shaughnessy of 12 College Green. Presumably, it was commissioned by the organising committee. In fact, we know nothing about it. He had his connection in that, talking about portraits and so on. He had lithographed a portrait of O'Connell in 1844, and that presumably got the connection going. O'Shaughnessy's plain but innovative map was not designed for longevity. Not only was it printed on very poor paper, it was very awkward. It's 100 centimeters, so it's a meter. It's 3 feet, you might say, in old money. And though many would have been kept as souvenirs, it seems that next to none have survived. This is the only one we know of. My co-author in the book in which this appears, Dublin, Mapping the City, Paul Ferguson, is the map librarian in Trinity, and he found it some years ago under a cat. in one of his storerooms, the cat having dragged it from somewhere and used it as a bed. We did have to remove some cat traces from the map before we could do it. So the map becomes important the following day. The funeral procession is due to begin at 11 a.m. and a strict order of precedence has been determined. And the Freeman's Journal make it clear, if you're not going to do it, you're not going to go. So the various groups were organised, and they were told that they had to do it in sequence. Now, the head of the procession is in Nassau Street, Clare Street. And here we have the trades to form accordingly: the nailers, the tobacconists, the bootmakers, the paper makers, etc. So these guys all get here, and they're led by the city marshal. Around the corner here, we have another of these political statements. The triumphal car is in College Green, outside Trinity College. Now, you couldn't have picked a better location for it. Well, sorry, that's why they picked it. Here we have it here. The O'Connell's triumphal car will be here. College Green, with all of the association of the Dublin Volunteers and all of that. And here we have the Illustrated London News showing the throngs, and here is the triumphal car. O'Connell, as you know, had been accused of sedition sometime previously, had gone to prison, had been vindicated, and upon his vindication had been borne through the city on this car, this throne and so on. So you're making a big point here by sticking this in College Green, in front of Trinity College, in front of the old Parliament building, and College Green itself. And here we have, and that's sitting there waiting. Then behind that we have the confraternities, and eventually we get to the other side of the Liffey, and we have the pupils of the Christian schools, North Richmond Street and Christian Brothers. So O'Connell schools have a day out, and they're going to be there. And we then move to the clergy. And you can see that there is a huge and large number of clergy. Now, we come to the main dignitaries. The main procession assembled at the Metropolitan Church, and here is the hearse. We have the physician, we have other people associated, we have the family and mourning coaches. And then we have all of the dignitaries from civic society, civil society, from Dublin itself, and from the rest of the country. And these are in carriages. These folks could not be expected to walk. Now, there's a bit of irony here. They are stretched and down Mecklenburgh Street and Gloucester Street. Now, these streets had not yet got their reputation that they were going to have by the end of the century, when they are become one of the focuses of the brothels and prostitution in the city, but they were in decline. And there were tenements not on the main streets, but on the lanes behind. And so there would have been quite a contrast between the finery of the archbishops, the bishops, the clergy, the nobility, the judges, the high sheriff, the under-secretary, members of the houses of commons and gentry, aldermen and town council of the city of Dublin and their carriages. You will notice that the Lord Lieutenant is not there. You will notice as well that the Chief Secretary is not there either. And how do you manage the ordinary folks, the hoi polloi of the city? Well, they're invited, absolutely they're invited. But they must organise themselves by their wards, and they must do so at Rutland Square. But let's say people might be concerned about the degree of enthusiasm which the hoi polloi might express at such an event such as this. So we have here persons on horseback, 4 abreast, at the top of Sackville Street, effectively cutting off any suggestion that anybody else might get into the procession before their appointed time. And if we just turn it around, we have the deputations of the various parts of the city, and they're all organised around here, the City of Dublin, according to their wards. And so it continues. It moves through the city, makes its way to Glasnevin Cemetery, where access is equally stage managed. What happens is that the carriages all head down the North Circular Road and go home. And bit by bit, the various groups are lined up on the street as a guard of honour, so that the cortege gets smaller and smaller and smaller, until eventually, when you get into Glasnevin Cemetery, it is a much smaller group, and the body is laid to rest in the circle, the ceremonial circle which had been created in the cemetery, while it awaited further developments. And there, thank you.
So our last speaker is Maurice J. Brick, Emeritus Professor of History at University College Dublin, and Director of the annual Daniel O'Connell Summer School. This lecture will focus on Daniel O'Connell as depicted in contemporary cartoons and caricatures, and special attention will be given to the topics of Catholic emancipation and the developing campaign for reform. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Maurice Brick. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for your welcome. I'm sorry I have to sit down, but my back has been giving me some trouble over the last few days, but not to worry, we will rise again, you know. Yes, sir. Okay. Now, I don't know what the equivalent of the graveyard shift is before lunch, but I certainly have landed that particular slot today. But I promise not to intrude on your lunchtime any more than I have to, and I will stick to my 20 minutes. No doubt Aoife will be keeping me in form. A few months ago, I was asked by the Society to contribute something on the lives and legacies of O'Connell to this symposium. And rather than maybe focusing on part of his political life, I thought that you might be more interested in seeing how that historical narrative, or part of it at least, is represented in caricatures. Now, I have actually quite a large collection of caricatures myself, and I've been buying them and nurturing them for the last 50 years or so, but I've never actually analysed them or looked at them, so I thought it might be a good idea. This might give me an opportunity to actually look at them finally, and actually they're quite fascinating. And I'm very frustrated by the fact that I have so many of them, and I can't kind of present more and more of them to you this afternoon. But anyway, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to concentrate on about 4 or 5 of them. As I have said, I was asked to speak about caricatures, and I had a rather lengthy introduction to try and put them in some kind of historical context. But again, time constraints being time constraints, I'm not going to focus on that introduction. I'm just going to go straight into the caricatures, but just with maybe one point to make. I think I would like to refer very briefly to a very interesting article that was published in 1971 by that great historian of the French and Napoleonic revolutions, a man called Robert Darnton. And the title of Robert Darnton's article was The High Enlightenment and Low Life Literature. And I think in ways maybe the title is self-explanatory, because basically Darnton's thesis was that in explaining the origins of the French Revolution and the background to the execution of the King and Queen, that it is not sufficient to focus on what I might call the high enlightenment, the writings of Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot and the philosophes and so forth, and to use their criticisms of the Ancien Regime by way of explaining why it fell apart. That you also have to look at what he called low-life literature, or the Grub Street Press. And the Grub Street Press was actually quite important to Darnton in explaining why the Ancien Regime, not just in France, but in other parts of Europe, why it fell apart. And basically the thesis was that if you look at the Grub Street literature, the King and Queen and leading personalities of the Ancien Regime, of course, feature very much in that literature. But instead of depicting them as sort of not representatives of the exponents of authority, all of which derive from God, or the management of the divine right monarchy, instead of presenting them in these sort of mystical terms, instead he depicted them as people who were corrupt, who were people of easy virtue, as my Latin teacher used to call it, to translate of it. And so therefore, instead of focusing on what they did to manage the ancien regime, that instead you have depictions of the king and queen living and working in the back streets of Paris, engaged in all sorts of depraved activities, and presenting the king and especially the queen as servicing the sexual expectations of men and women and things of that sort. And the whole idea was to present them, as I said, in these depraved terms, so that when it came to executing them, you were not really executing the representatives on earth of the divinity, but you were actually punishing them for their misdemeanors as ordinary human beings. So therefore, the execution of the king, and in particular of Marie Antoinette, was not just about, as I said, executing a king and queen. It was about executing somebody who was one of themselves. And when the sans-culottes of Paris went back to home that evening, they did so not in expectation that the divinity was going to rain down, thunderbolts and so forth on them as they slept in their beds. They had passed that. So the point is, therefore, that the ancien regime and the people who represented it were, if you like, human and were as exposed to human frailties as anybody else would, and had to be published accordingly. Now, I'm not saying that what happened in contemporary England in the 1790s was quite like that, because, of course, the English system, the ancien regime, was quite different in that it had its constitution. It wasn't the arbitrary monarchy, the divine right monarchy that one had in France. But nonetheless, during the 1790s, and particularly in the caricatures of John Gilray, you are presented with a system which is in need of reform or needs to be reinvented in some way, shape, or form. And that's the link between France and London in this particular context. But as I have said, London had its own, or England had its own constitution, the so-called Constitution of 1688, or reinforced by the Protestant ascendancy as we know it. That Protestant ascendancy, as you know, of course, had not been achieved without trouble, because there were two civil wars in England during the 16th century, which had seen to the beheading of King Charles I, and then by the removal of James II, and then the inauguration of the Williamite ascendancy and the Protestant ascendancy, as it's called. And of course, then its reinforcement during the 18th century by the penal laws. Now, the penal laws, which are central to what I want to talk about today, as we know, they're being presented in all sorts of ways, but I think we've kind of gotten over the idea that there were a series of sectarian laws in the narrow sense of the word, that instead the objective was to ensure that Catholics, having backed the wrong horse in the 17th century in relation to Charles I and James II, that they would never be in a position to undermine the Protestant succession again, or the Protestant ascendancy again. So therefore, in depriving them of the right to vote, or the right to bear arms, or the right to enter the professions, or to vote, or to enter Parliament, and so forth, that you were depriving them of any platform which they could use to undermine or to compromise the Protestant succession. And that system continued until the end of the 18th century, when these laws were repealed. And they were repealed partly because of the influence of the Enlightenment, partly because of the influence of the French Revolution, and partly because the Catholic and Protestant interests of Ireland and England at that stage were more pragmatic, let's say, in the way in which they approached one another. So all of this is by way of very quick historical background, placing Catholic emancipation and the fight for it in some kind of a historical background. So my apologies to people like Patrick Gagan for going through this history in about 2 seconds and presenting a very complicated history in literally a few minutes. It is much more complicated, but I hope I've given you a sense of the historical background in any event. Now, what happens, of course, when you come into 1800 is that we have these negotiations for the Union of Ireland and Britain, and as part of that negotiation, the one penal law which remained on the statute book, which was the right of Catholics to sit in Parliament, that had to be addressed. And as part of the agreement that was made, in return for processing the Union, it was agreed to introduce Catholic emancipation. Now, there were, of course, despite the promises that were made, there were reservations about that even after the Union was passed, because the King, at that time, George III, and later his successors, William IV, George IV, they believed that to give Catholics Catholic emancipation was to compromise their coronation oath, because the coronation oath obliged the monarch to uphold the church as by law established. In other words, the Protestant succession. And that was an oath, a sacred oath that the king had taken. And so therefore he regarded Catholic emancipation as an abrogation of that, as a confrontation of that. And so therefore that is why, to a greater or lesser degree, during the early years of the 19th century, they were slow to move Catholic emancipation, and why so many petitions had to be forwarded in order to present it or to bring it about. So after all that long palaver, let me come to my first caricature, exhibit A, so to speak. Now let me see, what do I do again, Emily? Which one do I press here again? This one. So this is a wonderful caricature from 1805. It's by the great John Gilray. And basically what you have here is a representation in caricature form of a petition that was presented by Fox and Greville and Grattan and various people in 1805, asking the government to actually do the needful and to pass Catholic emancipation as had been promised in 1800. And if you look at it, you have the supporters and the opponents, for there were both, opponents and supporters. The supporters are to the right, being thrown back for various reasons that I mentioned in a moment. They're the supporters, Greville, Fox, and so forth. In fact, Fox has this cardinal's hat. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see the cardinal's hat there? He's represented as the papal legate, the idea being there that he is sent by the Pope, like all legates are, rather than by what is good for the wider polity of England. And then on the left-hand side, just this side, on this side, sorry, you have the opponents, as I said, people like Pitt, Hawkesbury and Sidmouth, who are blowing back in gusts of wind, the supporters, blowing them back, because what they don't want them to do is to ascend the golden staircase, because the golden staircase is what brings them up to emancipation. And there at the very top you find this, let me see now again, I have it here. There you find St. Peter, or rather stern-faced St. Peter, and there he has the keys, inviting people to go in to dinner and to have the repast inside. But as you see, over the door, you have a thing called Popish supremacy. So the point is, if you ascend the stairwell, and if you grant Catholic emancipation, that is what you have to look forward to, Popish supremacy. And if you were in any doubt about it, there you have St. Peter with his keys, ensuring that you would be locked in and you'd have to suffer the consequences. So as I have said, this was too much for Pitt and so forth, and they were trying to blow back, that is sort of a metaphor of the power of their oratory, I think, to blow them back into such a position that they would be incapable of treading the stairs upwards. And then on the other side, as I've said, you have the supporters of emancipation being thrown back on themselves by the power of argument. And also, of course, being thrown back on a lot of the iconography of the Popish Church. And there you have the Popish Church being represented by all sorts of things, you know, holy water and incense and the sale of indulgences, the articles on infallibility, absolution for sale, all things of that sort. So they're being thrown back, if you like, on the images of popishness, because that is what Catholic emancipation means. It means popish supremacy, and it means that you have to take these symbols of Catholic religion into the established church, which was a campaign that the established church had fought for so long to keep within their own Reformed church. Now, so there were quite a number of these petitions, of course, continued during the years after 1805. Quite a number of them, and they're pretty much of a muchness. But they lead me up to the next one in 1813, which again coincides with yet another petition being presented, this time by Henry Grattan. This again is a very interesting caricature. It has a lot of the kind of, you probably can't see a lot of the detail, but the detail actually, please don't worry about it, but let me just explain to you what the iconography is. Basically what it says, it represents the king, King George III at the very top there, and he's sitting atop a wishbone. And the wishbone, of course, has to be severed. So you have the people on both sides wishing for Catholic emancipation on the one hand, and wishing that it would not be introduced on the other. And you have them fighting against one another, pro and con. But the interesting thing about this particular caricature is that it's not just being represented as a tussle, a tug of war between pro and anti-emancipationists. It is also being presented in nationalistic terms, because on the right-hand side, there you see the Irish being somewhat dressed rather scantily and looking not very elegantly. Whereas, of course, the people who are representing the established church are very finely dressed and so forth. So the interesting thing about that caricature is that in addition to the pro and anti arguments, it is also being presented as a national argument. In other words, that Catholic emancipation is being presented as an Irish issue, whereas the support for the Protestant church is being represented as an English issue. And the two are and that kind of notion of nationality creeping into this debate is actually quite interesting, because as we know, Catholic emancipation was not just about giving rights to Irish Catholics, but was also about giving rights to English Catholics, who were quite a distinguished part of the English polity, but deprived of their rights no more or no less than Irish Catholics were. But still, it is the Gombean Irishman, as I said, who is being represented as the champion of Catholic emancipation and as a bedraggled kind of class, and that was not on. So do we want people like this being brought into our system? If we are to follow that iconography, we certainly don't. We leave them over in Ireland. And that kind of idea was reproduced a number of times. There's a similar example of the same kind of idea with King George IV, in this case, with 1 foot in England, 1 foot in Ireland, again being torn both ways by the forces who are defending the Protestant ascendancy on the right and the forces of Catholic emancipation on the other. Now, yes, okay, now here we are. Yeah. Just again, I'm including this caricature because I just want to make the point that the petitions for Catholic emancipation were not just a Catholic matter. There were also people in Ireland who opposed Catholic emancipation and were just as forthright and just as organised as Daniel O'Connell was in developing his campaign. And this is an example of one such trip to London by those who wanted to make their case against emancipation. And the man in the coach is the then Lord Mayor of Dublin, Alexander King. Now, Alexander King is quite an interesting figure in the campaign about Catholic emancipation. He was a leading member of not quite the Orange Order, but I would call it of Orangism here in Ireland, and in particular in Dublin, and as I said, was Lord Mayor on a number of occasions during the 1820s. And he was a stern and fierce opponent of Catholic emancipation. So therefore he and O'Connell had various tussles, let's say, during the course of the 1820s, many of which are captivated in caricature, and that's why I'm just introducing Abraham King through this particular caricature. And there you see his supporters are just as active and just as agile as O'Connell's men were, and so forth, as they make their way to London. Now, this particular caricature reflects one of the tussles between O'Connell and King during the 1820s, and it's a very wonderful caricature, I think, from about 1823, and it shows O'Connell being fed the orange pudding, as he called it, by Alexander King. And the speech bubbles kind of tell their own tale. Let me see if I can get it here. Yes, you have a King kind of forcing O'Connell to eat a little bit of this orange pie, of course, which would be a very alien dish to O'Connell. And he says, "My dear Dan," he says, this is from the King. The King now is the chap dressed in red, obviously. He says, "My dear Dan, do take this little bit. I perceive you are quite unaccustomed to this kind of pudding, however, but after a little practice it will become quite easy and quite agreeable. It has been a favourite of mine for a number of years." And then O'Connell's speech bubble, we find him saying, "My dear Abraham, I don't well know how to refuse you. The sacrifices on your part have been so extraordinary and so completely in unison with my best wishes that, as I said before, nothing but inspiration from above could accomplish. Yet after my stomach being an entire stranger to your food, I'm afraid I shall not be able to digest it." And again, there are a number of other caricatures of that vein, which again convey the same point. And this brings me to the Clare election, the famous Clare election that Ben referred to earlier on. This was an election that took place, as you may know, in June of 1828, when a vacancy occurred in Parliament. And it was the first time that Daniel O'Connell, as a Catholic, stood for Parliament. Now, of course, Catholics, as you know, were not allowed to sit in Parliament, so therefore the fact that Daniel O'Connell was standing was actually quite a controversial and important mood. But the thing is that the decision lay with an interesting chap called the 40-shilling freeholder. And the 40-shilling freeholders were people who owned property that was worth 40 shillings or more a year. That entitled them to vote. And because, as I've said, the laws forbidding Catholics to vote had already been repealed before 1800, Catholics could in fact vote, provided they satisfied the property requirement. But the thing is, they had to do what their landlords told them to do. The landlords said, vote for this, or vote for him, or vote for... Or if they didn't, when their leases were renewed, simply the leases would not be renewed. So therefore, you have the Catholic priest on the one side here, and the landlord on the other, trying to convince, my goodness, am I up there already? Trying to convince the 40-shilling freeholder to vote in one way or the other. And so therefore we find, for example, the priest whispering sweet nothings into the ear of the 40-shilling freeholder, threatening him with the evils of the next life. You can see there with him being, the 40-shilling freeholder being exposed to some sort of unmentionable trouble. And of course, again, the eviction of people if they didn't carry their way. But nonetheless, that does not get away from the point of view that the Catholic emancipation election, as it is often called in Clare, was still seen as an election that would elect a Catholic, and by electing Catholics, introduce the English Parliament or the United Parliament into a system of popishness. And if anybody was any doubt, there you have O'Connell praying before his bishop, whom he happened to meet during the course of a canvass in Ennis, walking down the street, and of course he immediately prostrates himself and the bishop gives him his blessing. So if anybody was any doubt about what Catholic emancipation meant, it meant one thing. It meant toleration for Catholics, yes, but toleration, a type of toleration that would, what's the word I'm looking for, would burden the Church of Ireland in a way that it would have to change itself. Catholic emancipation could not be achieved, in other words, without the sacrifice of certain elements of the Church of Ireland as the established church. And actually, so this is not just between Catholics and Protestants, as is often presented. It's about really what citizenship meant, and about the idea, if you were a Catholic, that in fact, yes, you could be a Catholic, yes, you could have private beliefs, but of course that did not necessarily mean that you were incapable of giving a loyalty to the Crown as well, even if the Crown and the head of the church were from another tradition or from another ethos. And that's, I think, the remarkable thing about Catholic emancipation. It wasn't just about giving rights to Catholics, it was about expanding the definition of citizenship that could encompass all kinds of people and could trust, if you like, individual Catholics or individual Presbyterians or so forth to pass legislation and to discuss legislation and to enact legislation without necessarily having the world fall around you or the English system falling completely into tatters. So again, I'm sorry for much of the ad-libbing, and I hope I haven't spoken too quickly, but I don't want to be eating into your lunchtime, so it's just something I know you would not forgive me. So thank you very much for your attention.